So, so I've titled my paper, Robert Smithson, New Materialism in Reverse. And what I'm looking at today is similar ideas from different eras. And New Materialism emerged decades after the work of Robert Smithson. Yet New Materialism and Robert Smithson deal with curiously similar concepts. My paper today speculates around the idea of Smithson's work and writing as being prophetic to New Materialism's concerns with agential matter and the human and non-human binary. Robert Smithson was a seminal artist of the 1960s and 1970s who was singularly materialist in his approach. Yet little has been written connecting New Materialism to Smithson's practice and writings, particularly around his interest in entropy. Entropy became an allegorical and conceptual tool that Smithson used to critique human interests and expose the performativity of energy and matter in nature. Similarly, New Materialism assumes everything is reducible to matter and is driven by ecological, ethical, and political dimensions that rethink the relationship between the Anthropocene and the world. My paper proposes parallels between Smithson's use of entropy and materialism, and at what points does Smithson's treatment of entropy in his work and writing align with New Materialist thinking? Where do New Materialism and Smithson's ideas around material performativity, that word, and human interests intersect? And where do the ideas of Smithson's use of entropy and New Materialism depart? My paper explores these questions by connecting the historical trajectory of materialism to Smithson's critical use of entropy in his writing and work. The similarities between old materialism and entropy are uncanny. Both centre their theories around a void or a closed system of energy exchange. Each speak of matter or atoms as separate but working together with change occurring through a combination of contact and thermal and chemical factors such as hot, cold, bitter or sweet. Both theories speak of the dynamism of matter or atoms that unfold as a swerve or as an unpredictable or chaotic movement. But what are the finer points of materialism and how have they emerged and intersected in history? So these images you see on the screen are of images that Smithson took on a tour to a steel production factory in Oberhausen in Germany, and he was entranced by the apocalyptic entropic landscape. So this is basically just metal slag, but it really captured that sort of notion of entropy that Smithson was deeply interested in. Excuse me. Okay. This is a nice image, Democritus. So I just need you to stay with me at this point, so I'm going to go back into Greek classics here, but if you can stay with me, it connects up later on. In Greek philosophy, Plato and Aristotle were crucial to the establishment of the key areas of Western philosophical thought, namely reason and empiricism. Both these terms create the anthropocentric narrative, namely that the human mind and I are central to the world. However, in the Greek school, it was Epicurus who believed the world consisted of movement and interactivity of atoms in space. This departed from Greek debates concerned with ideal forms and the appearance of things. Epicurus was influenced by Democritus, who developed the systematic theory of atomistic materialism in the 4th century BC. Democritus's theory speaks of uncuttable atoma in a void and change that occurs through contact in motion. Atoma have no secondary qualities and are indestructible. Democritus also held that things are hot, cold, bitter or sweet and have different colours by convention. Epicurus was influenced by the work of Lucretius, who termed the productive movement and dynamism of atoms in motion as a clinomen, or what he presented as a gentle matter. Indeed, it was Democritus's initial concept in ancient Greece that marked the beginning of materialist theories that traversed the dialectical philosophies of Engels and Marx to the scientifically based theories of recent centuries. So entropy is one of these scientifically based theories that emerged in recent centuries. In many respects, it holds parallels with the terms of old materialism. This is evident in the movement of energy or atoms within a system independently. However, it differs slightly in the sense that its outcomes are irreversible. The scientific concept of entropy was developed by a French mathematician, Lazare Carnot, in his 1803 paper, Fundamental Principles of Equilibrium and Movement. It stipulated that in any natural process there exists an inherent tendency towards the dissipation of useful energy. So the first law stipulates that energy is materially constant and cannot be created or destroyed. The second law of thermodynamics regards entropy as a constantly dissipating force within the universe that unstitches order, working progressively towards natural disorder. Therefore, in a closed system of the universe, the second law of thermodynamics anticipates that entropy will lead to the ultimate heat death of the universe. So what you see here is a book by P.W. Bridgman, and what I've given you is actually a very scientific explanation of entropy. Robert Smithson was interested in thermodynamics, but when it came to the language of describing entropy, he began to use it as this expressive tool in his artworks. So he was interested in that whole idea of that notion of devolution in the earth, and that sort of a relationship between man and nature in terms of that devolution. But he was also interested in the language of entropy, and in this particular book, P.W. Bridgman actually used very specific language he talked about the language of describing entropy. And he also spoke about a lot of dead spaces, and as you'll see later on, Smithson speaks about non-space and dead space and so on. Okay, so I'm going to begin with a quote from Smithson, and it's from an interview with Alison Skye in Site 4 in 1973. Okay, so on the whole, I would say entropy contradicts the usual notion of a mechanistic worldview. In other words, it's a condition that's moving towards a gradual equilibrium, and it's suggested in many ways. End quote. Something about being up here today, you lose your page. Okay. Smithson's work fell into the category of process art in the 1960s. Process art's tendency to employ no longer useful or ruined materials broke from traditional arts conventions and presented imagery that fell in stark contrast to the progress of World War II America. The anti-aesthetic of the unmade proved ideal for Smithson's deep exploration of the notion of entropy. In the 1960s, Smithson wrote about non-spaces. So, as I was mentioning before in P.W. Bridgman's book, non-spaces were typified by industrial banality, in emptiness and no feeling. These spaces included disused railway lines, industrial wastelands, urban developments and new shopping centres. So if you can just picture that 1950s shopping centre that streams on forever, just an endless space of modernist architecture, that was a non-space. Smithson was particularly interested in sites where humanised environments intersected with fluvial movements or geomorphical massing, so geological masses, so where a highway cuts through the bedrock. That's a sort of intersection between that the natural environment and then a man-made intersection. Non-spaces provided Smithson with the visual and material characteristics of entropy and the conceptual means for collapsing time and inverting the future with the present. Smithson's non-spaces were humanised environments that exposed the economic and connected geopolitical and sociological issues of the time. So the images you see on the screen are of mining sites, and they were called the proposed mining projects. Smithson also spoke about them as land reclamation. And what he was doing was contacting the mining companies and proposing that he worked into the sites afterwards. And the argument that he was presenting was that by him bringing earth art to the mines, he was increasing the value of the property, but also casting mining activity in a better light to the general public. Okay, the time machine. So Smithson most likely discovered entropy in the writings of H.G. Wells, with whom he acknowledges as an influential in his upbringing. The time machine depicts a hero travelling forward in time to discover the dissolution of the social classes and Earth bathed in a red sun in what could be described as the final clutches of the entropic end. Wells specifically refers to the second law of thermodynamics. Thermodynamics in the time machine indeed is a large proportion of the science fiction culture that proliferated in the 1920s and was centred around the concept of entropy and an uncomfortable mix of evolution and decay in space-like context. The notion of a time machine was something that the authors of the period were using to move backward and forward in time realistically, and a concept that would later emerge in Smithson's essays such as Entropy and the New Monuments and his travelogue, A Tour of the Monuments of Passaic. Also likely to be of influence to Smithson in the 1960s was The Crystal World by J.G. Ballard. It depicts the end of the world scenario where all matter transforms into crystalline structures. The book speaks of antimatter and the conception of anti-time, where the collisions of particles lead to the destruction of their physical identities and a situation where their own time values cancel each other out. So to quote Ballard's text here, the process is theoretically without end, and it may be possible eventually for a single atom to produce an infinite number of duplicates of itself, and so fill the entire universe from which simultaneously all time has expired, an ultimate macrocosmic zero beyond the wildest dreams of Plato and Democritus. End quote. Now I'm going to take you to a tour of the monuments of Passaic. So this is Smithson's essay that he wrote in 1967. It's a very famous one, and most of you probably know of it. So it's a travelogue to his boyhood hometown. A highway was being built along the Passaic River as part of a large national highway construction program. The town had been transformed into a shopping strip with a highway running through its centre. It's a notable example of Smithson's interest in geology and the intersection between human interests and entropy. Smithson's tour is a pessimistic account of the industriousness of urban sprawl, and in which he describes a series of monuments ranging from industrial pipes to a monumental car park. It presents a scathing critique of modernist progress and civic planning, all of which contribute to Smithson's ideas around the proliferation of banal urban spaces, which he called non-spaces. So within these images you can see the monuments that he identifies them as monuments, but within the essay he actually writes specifically about the monuments and how they relate to entropy, and probably the most famous one is the sandbox, which you can see in the bottom right-hand corner here. And so there's a final section that I'm going to read you here. So before I do read this final section to you, I did want to return to my earlier question at the beginning. At what point does Smithson's treatment of entropy in his work and writing align with new materialist thinking? Smithson's use of entropy in the sandbox resonates strongly with new materialism's notion that everything is reducible to matter and material forces. So just onto that, a quote from that, and this is quoting Smithson. "The monument of minute particles blazed under a bleakly glowing sun and suggested the sullen dissolution of entire continents, the drying up of oceans. No longer were there green forests and high mountains. All that existed were millions of grains of sand, a vast deposit of bones, and stones pulverised into dust," end quote. So although it's a real sort of doomsday scenario kind of situation that he's presenting there, it does have similar resonances with new materialism in that it holds very strong concerns for the environment. There are clear links between old materialism and new materialism and Smithson's use of entropy to critique human interests. However, before I move forward, it is important to note that as one moves forward in the 20th century, you see the scientific nihilism of entropy rejected by the likes of Gilles Deleuze, indifference and repetition. And here I remind you of my earlier question: where do the ideas of Smithson's use of entropy and new materialism depart? Deleuze viewed entropy as providing only an explanation for the negation of difference in the world through an equalisation of the unequal or difference in temperatures. Deleuze also claimed that entropy did not account for, quote, many things of another order, end quote. Deleuze refers to Nietzsche's eternal return as this theory pertains to difference as possessing its own concept. It was Deleuze who went on to develop the structuralist assemblage theory with Felix Guattari, which in some respects holds parallels with the swerving atoms of Democritus. So one could say that new materialism in the 20th century has emerged in a similar context to that of Smithson's work in the 1960s and 1970s. We are now experiencing the miasma of climate change and its far-reaching ecological impacts, similar to the environmental and anti-capitalist movements of the Smithson era. New materialism is underpinned by similar ethical, political, and ecological dimensions. Central to the material turn is agential matter, where non-human elements and actants combine in a non-human binary. Such a theory is described in Vital Matter, A Political Ecology of Things by Jane Bennett. In Chapter 1, Thing Power, Debris, Bennett uses the example of a travelogue to a New Jersey garbage chip by an author called Robert Sullivan, which describes the vital life of materials after they are thrown out. And it adopts a similar tone to Smithson's tour of the monuments of Passaic. So I'll quote Sullivan here. So this is from his essay To That Tip. "There had been rain the night before, so it wasn't long before I found a little leachate seep, a black ooze, trickling down the slope of the hill, an espresso of refuse. In a few hours, this stream would find its way down into the groundwater of the meadowlands, where it would mingle with toxic streams," end quote. Barrett's chapter on the agency of assemblages is easily relatable to Smithson's interest in matter and entropy. Assemblage theories analyse systems that appear to be operating holistically, but are actually confederations of diverse elements functioning through the presence of each other rather than being led by a central entity, i.e. one material is not determinant of the direction or efficacy of the group, the outcomes of generative assemblage, are emergent fledgling properties, fledgling in their capacity to create less predictable events. Barrett offers the electrical power grid as an example of an assemblage. It offers human elements, capital, social, logistical, but also includes extremely powerful non-human traits in the form of an electrical current, wind, fire, and electromagnetic fields. So this example helps one understand how an assemblage works between the human and non-human division. So this takes me to a very well-known artwork by Smithson. It's called Spiral Jetty. It's widely accepted that the monumental earthwork Spiral Jetty expanded the spatial realm of art. For Smithson, it represented a break from the confines of the gallery and his previous non-site works. In developing Spiral Jetty, Smithson saw himself as a composer of geological formations, natural materials, the waste of the mining industry, and the forces of nature in the landscape. Spiral Jetty could be described as a monument to nature that tackles the serious political questions about the Anthropocene's relationship with Mother Earth. So it composes the forces of nature by embodying immanence, material performativity, and entropy. So some of these images that you see here, this is August 2003, and the previous one was when it was built in 1970. And for those who don't know how it was built, it was the rocks were taken from another site, and then a dump truck just basically dumped all the rocks there until they built this massive jetty. So it's quite a big excavation. So Spiral Jetty was built in 1970 on the Great Salt Lake of Utah and consists of 6,650 tonnes of basalt and limestone from a nearby point. Jetty was set on the edge of an alluvial fan and fault line that allowed the oil to seep up from shattered rocks along it. There'd been mining activity in the area, so there were plans to mine the oil from the lake and the surrounding area. But what that left was some problems with the environment and the oil seeping up through the holes. So there were plans to develop an oil field on it, but these were since abandoned. There were other derelict and uncapped wells in the vicinity of Jetty, which coated much of the volcanic basalt of the area. So you've got that mix between the natural environment of the Salt Lake, but then man's industrial repercussions in terms of the oil and the damage to the rock. Jetty, which coated much of the, this really suited Smithson's interest in the intersection between man's industriousness and nature. There were three options for experiencing the site. From the air, walk the jetty, it's now submerged, or hike up the rocky slope. And the work consists of multiple works that frame the physical jetty. So there's a film and an epic essay where there are several references to matter and entropy and the performativity of materials. So that's the message I'm trying to get across is it's I think it's quite a prophetic work for new materialism. Okay, so these are two quotations, and I think they sort of frame what Smithson was trying to do with the work here. So he stated that he wanted the work to be physical enough to withstand the climate changes, yet intimately involved with those climatic changes and natural disturbances. And he also wanted the jetty to induce salt crystals on the rocks and gravel encrustations that will develop over time. So similar to the actants in Bennett's assemblages, so that was the trip to the New Jersey tip and the power grid, Smithson's spiral jetty could be described as a composition of non-human and human material performativity, where natural geological minerals, rocks and liquids interact with the waste of mining activity and the elements. In his essay, he described this as protoplasmic solutions, the essential matter between formed and the unformed. Quote, so this is an image of the jetty submerged, and it's a recent image. So you can see from all the different angles, and depending on the time of year and the light, it always sort of has a different way of producing light reflection, so the colour's always different. So in conclusion, I propose that Smithson's work and writings preempt new materialism in several ways. Through his focus on entropy, Smithson developed an eco-aesthetic that exposes human and non-human intersections in the environment and raises questions around the sustainability of its resources. A key thread of new materialism. Spiral Jetty in particular embodies the material turn through its composition of natural and human-affected matter and its resultant performativity over time. It is now submerged but remains a strong example of Smithson's art, representing the agency of matter and its ability to enact change or make something happen without human intervention. Thank you.